It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's performance and lecture entitled Through the Looking Glass, Prokofiev's First String Quartet, with the wonderful and amazing Sheffield chamber players who have just taken their places. I just want to make a couple of brief comments. First of all, thank you to Katie Sangler-Jackson, who's not here tonight, who really helped organize the logistics of tonight's concert, as well as student assistants Pamela Weinstein-Malloy and Dasha Osipova, who just did fantastic work to make everything come together for tonight. So thank you all. And I want to just offer a brief announcement that our next Russian Area Studies event, correct me if I'm wrong, Nina, is going to be on Wednesday, October 24th at 8 p.m. in the library lecture room in Clapp Library. It's going to be a lecture entitled Leningrad at War, delivered by Polina Barskova, who's a superb lecturer. I urge you all to come to Leningrad at War on the 24th. Mark your calendars. This is our second collaboration with Sheffield chamber players. They are delightful musicians and delightful people. I think you're really going to enjoy this evening's proceedings. And I want to sort of especially thank, even though she's no longer with us, Maria Apostol-Tyler, who endowed a fund for the Russian department that made tonight's concert possible. So without further ado, take it away, Sheffield.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks to the Russian department of Rosa College for inviting us. I apologize in advance. I may sound like I have allergies, but I'm really fine. What's going on? I thought I'd just say a few words about the group, and then we'll proceed to talk about the piece. Our group got founded a few years ago, 5 years in this season, and we specialize in house concerts and creating environments where we play chamber music for the settings in which it was designed for. We try to recreate it a little bit with this setup right here. But we mostly play in private homes, and if you would like to attend any of these concerts, you should get on our mailing list, because that's the only way you can request invitations, since these concerts are held in private homes. Simply add your name over there, and we'll be happy to see you again. Now that that is behind us, I'd be happy to talk about the piece we're playing tonight. I'll say a few words about Prokofiev himself. We'll talk about the history of writing this piece, the circumstances that led to him writing this piece, and then we'll dig into the piece a little bit and explore the themes, explore the ideas that he uses in this piece, as well as some of his tricks, so to say, and his unique writing language. So the piece was written in 1930. And at that same year, Prokofiev gives a very revealing interview to Olin Downs of the New York Times. He says in that interview, "Why do they continue to speak of me as only a satirist or a sarcastic composer, or an enfant terrible discord, etc.? Perhaps this was true 15 years ago, when that was my spirit and somewhat my style. But I have left that period behind. I have become simpler and more melodic. We want a simpler and more melodic style for music, a simple, less complicated emotional state, and dissonance again relegated to its proper place as one element of music. I think we have gone as far as we're likely to go in the direction of size, or dissonance, or complexity in music. Music, in other words, has definitely reached and passed the greatest degree of discord and complexity that can be attained in practice. I want nothing better, more flexible and more complete. That's not a form which contains everything necessary for my structural purposes." To understand why this was surprising to many people who read it, we should go back a little bit and explain what kind of reputation Prokofiev had at the time. He is talking about 15 years ago, and he is quite right with that. Ever since he was 4½, he showed up to his mom with a paper which had note-like drawings drawn on a 9-staff line, and declared, "Hi Mom, look, I've written a Rhapsody by Liszt." And he actually kept writing ever since. He of course had some schooling in how to do so, but he always had his own mind in creating his compositions. he always had a very peculiar, inquisitive, and powerful intellect that led him in all sorts of funny directions, not all of them coinciding with those that his teachers wanted him to go towards. So when he enters the St. Petersburg Conservatory, he essentially follows two sets of rules. One are those of his teachers, and the other, those of his own. He creates his own compositions which mostly break all the harmonic and counterpoint rules established by that his teachers worked so hard to get him to learn and to understand. And at the same time, he submits these perfectly done homework assignments, being by far one of the youngest students in the class. But that's not the only thing that led to him adopting the name of Enfant terrible, or the bad boy of music. He liked to keep certain statistics on his fellow students, as in he kept track of how many mistakes they made. He found it kind of fascinating. He also liked to imitate the manners and the walk of the head of the conservatory, who was a rather large man. He would stuff the pillow under his jacket and go to the store maintaining his posture, for which he also got in trouble. He liked to have fun, sometimes at the expense of others, but nevertheless he didn't mean anything bad with it. He had a naturally very strong resilience to criticism. So when I'm going to read a little bit of the description, you'll see that's pretty typical of his concerts around the time. This is from the 1913, and his second piano concerto is not being premiered, but is being performed by himself. And here's what one of the observers wrote. A youth with the face of a high school student appears on stage. This is Prokofiev. He sits down at the piano and starts either wiping off the keys or trying them out to see which one produces a high or low sound. All this is done with a sharp, dry touch. The audience is uncertain. A few get upset. One couple rises and turns to the exit. Music like that can drive you crazy. Others leave their seats. The young artist concludes his concerto with a mercilessly dissonant combination of sounds from the brass. The scandal in the audience is now full-blown. The majority of them are hissing. Prokofiev bows impudent and plays an encore. Exclamations resound all around. Devil, take all this futurist music. We want to hear something pleasant. We can't hear music like this from our saxophone. Another group, the progressive critics, are in ecstasy. It's a work of genius. How innovative. What spirit and originality. And when they talk about him being innovative and being the music resembling that of cats, you have to realize that Prokofiev was composing against the grain of what was at the time predominant Russian school of composition. He is on the record pretty much as saying that he has no interest in sentimentality in music. He has no interest in large forms. He would like the music to be concise. He would like it to be non-sentimental in any way, and he is very fond of playfulness and of experimentation and of invention in music. So when he creates his harmony, let me just at this point illustrate a little bit what I'm talking about. So if we play, let's say, a G major chord, right? It sounds something like this. Now, if you guys hold this chord and play on this a little bit. If I play any of these notes, it's going to sound great, right? But if I'm going to start doing something that doesn't fit with this harmony, it's not going to please your ears that much. And so this is the kind of style that will annoy his teachers, who would want him to understand how to do the voicing properly before he could engage in this sort of thing. Little did they suspect that his mind was already way beyond that. In fact, his intellect was really quite astounding. He had two major hobbies, besides being a composer. he was a very formidable chess player. And in fact, he would sometimes keep track of a dozen chess games over the mail and would go on to chess tournaments regularly, where he would sometimes defeat world champions like Capablanca. Okay, that happened once. There were also others, and his fellow composers dreaded playing chess with him. And the other was that of a writer. His writing is really impressive. He has the knack of a really concise and colorful description, taking very few words, very much like his music. So while he is facing resistance at home, all the way through conservatory years and beyond, for the music that he's composing, so with so much invention, and he doesn't mind criticism in the least. He knows that was very characteristic of him. He always knew his own path, and he believed in it wholeheartedly. None of the critics could ever dissuade him from that. By the time the revolution happens, he migrates abroad, and he goes first via Siberia and Japan. He goes to the west coast of the United States, and eventually he makes his way to Paris. Paris, at that time, was the center of the universe as far as you're concerned. If you're an avant-garde composer, or writer, or painter, the plethora of talent that was at the time in Paris is really impressive. And while we have the entire universe kind of concentrated in the spot, he all of a sudden feels pushed to produce music that's more avant-garde than he has been creating. He's been criticized for being too conventional. And he goes along. He goes in this direction, and he lets his devil loose. In fact, Diaghilev, who he was working with, and who was at the center of that society, would characterize him as opposed to Stravinsky in a very interesting way. He said, while Stravinsky is much more tied to the gods, Prokofiev is friendly with the devils. Well, there's some devilry in his music, that's for sure, but following this kind of path doesn't quite lead Prokofiev to the place he expects to. And by the time his second symphony premieres in 1925, the piece that everybody expects him to produce along the lines of the most avant-garde compositions and shatter their imaginations and impress them beyond belief, it's not received so well. And in fact, Prokofiev himself, for the first time in his life, admits that, I was listening to this and I couldn't understand myself what's going on in this piece. That's the first time he ever doubts himself. And he writes in his diary that, for the first time in my life, I am doubting whether my destiny is to become that of a first-rate composer. Well, and it's at that point where he starts to gradually move away from this devilry, so to speak. Now, by the time he gives the Downs interview, it's worth noting that Soviet Union, which was the place where he didn't dare to go back for all these years, the reports from the Soviet Union starts coming to his ears that are rather interesting. His music is having a lot of popularity back there. All of his pieces are played to a great amount of success that he cannot dream of in the West. And he is very intrigued. He goes there and he is received well. There are some hiccups along the road, of course. But this is one of the things that kind of start this dynamic for him to shift his attention from being in the West and towards going back home. Well, all of these things would help explain why he is now in this place where he gives this kind of interview to Olin Downs and is directing his creativity away from the image of the enfant terrible and the person familiar with the devils. When Olin Downs met him a few years before, he gave him the following description, and a lot of it is informed by the kind of music that he had. He writes, Prokofiev the front of whose head is bald, whose face nevertheless seems incredibly young and very cerebral, like a being who has come from another age or planet, groomed and dressed in the style of today, come to examine a world upon which he may have sinister designs. A queer fellow who seems to be delving musically in a certain hinterland of the human consciousness, listening to what he has discovered there, with as much calmness and detachment as if he had seen a scientist, as if he had been a scientist discussing the theory of evolution. This is somewhat, it's a very impressive and very mystical image, and he earned it in a great way by having his music sort of go along the paths of that Stravinsky with his Rite of Spring, and plunging into the sort of imagined universe of the pre-Christian Russia with his Scythian suite. And that kind of direction was very interesting to the audience of Paris of the day. It plugged into the image of Russia being this mystical and quasi-barbaric place, full of mystery and this primal sort of energy that intrigued, scared, and fascinated those audiences. Not much has changed since then. But in reality, Prokofiev, by accounts given that of him from his friends and from people close to him, he seemed to have been a person who truly enjoyed life. And I would be really amiss if I would skip the quote and description of their vacation together by none else but the brother of the founder of this here Russian department. Vladimir Nabokov's brother Nicholas was a composer and a good friend of Prokofiev's, and he writes a very interesting description of their trip together around France. The tour had been long and tiring, partly because most of the day was spent in first ordering meals and then eating them and then attempting to digest them. But also because the Prokofiev menage had hourly squabbles, often ending with tears about what to do next. While Lina Ivanovna, his wife, and I'm pretty sure she wasn't Ivanovna, being Spanish, wanted to stop in every village, visit every cathedral, chateau, and museum, her husband wanted to go from one 3-star restaurant to the next one in the town he had scheduled as our next stop. While his wife looked for cozy inns with lovely views hidden in green valleys on the slopes of the charming mountain, he wanted to stay in town in the best hotel advertised in the Guide Michelin. He was not a bit interested in museums and cathedrals, and when compelled to join us in what he called our phony grave-digging ritual, he looked bored and gloomy. The only thing he could find to say looking at the Chartres Cathedral was, "I wonder how they got those statues up so high without dropping them." But when he had a large, fancy menu in his hand, his mien would change. He would brighten up and start ordering for each one of us the plat du jour or spécialité de la maison with the concomitant vin toupé. He sincerely loved life. This is not to diminish his interest in books. He was friends with some of the leading poets and writers of his day. But the optimism and the love for life in his music is something that came across in all of his compositions, despite him having a life that was obviously uniquely difficult if you look at it objectively. Having grown up in pre-revolutionary Russia, he experienced the First World War and the revolution. They've been thrown around all the way across the world to the United States and then to Europe. During these years, he's been touring all of these continents excessively. Sometimes he would have 2 United States tours and a Russian tour and the European tour in 1 year. He was on the road a lot. And in one of those trips, he was looking very closely at the quartets by Ludwig van Beethoven. And this was after he was commissioned to write this here piece. So he accepts the commission, which is remarkable in itself, because a quartet was considered kind of passé by avant-garde composers. It was very limiting. There's only 4 voices, they're all alike. You can't compose for a xylophone and the orchestra of trumpets. It has to be this kind of, management of delicate voicing was not in the interest of people who were pushing the boundaries of what the music can sound like. But he accepts the commission, and you can hear the parallels with Beethoven if we just play one of the Beethoven's quartet chords. So here is how the Beethoven quartet begins, that I believe he got inspired from. And I will play for you how the Prokofiev's quartet begins. So right off the bat you can hear the similarities between the texture in Beethoven, and here we have the melody outline is, and some of the material is very similar, and lastly but not the least importantly, the scale that is so strange. After material that was rather conventional. Can we just play the harmony in the beginning? This is not what you would expect from Prokofiev. It only gets crazy when we start playing the scale-like passage. This is going to be important later on, but as we have just played the beginning for now, we'll play another place a little later in the piece to show you what he does with the melody of the opera. So this is second bar. Second four. The accompaniment is similar. The melody doesn't seem to be related at all, and yet it seems to be very similar to the beginning. And you will hear these kind of similarities quite a lot through the piece. There will be a melody that sounds familiar to you, but you cannot place it before that. This is, in fact, a very important gift that he had that wasn't recognized until much later. While he was perceived as this kind of balletic and acrobatic, experimental, dry composer, people failed to realize that he was in fact one of the greatest melodists in the century. And it's his unusual, flavorful approach to melodic writing that, and at the same time flexibility that makes it so compelling and so expressive. By the time he enters this phase of going towards more expressive writing and more sort of deeper expression of feelings in his music, he really has a lot to build on, because his melodic gifts are there and his skills in shaping the melody are formidable. In the middle of this movement, right before we enter the second theme, we have a little serene melody from two violins that kind of transform music from being, Prokofiev's and sort of avant-garde and influenced by Beethoven. Here it sounds more Russian than it ever did before so far. Be followed by the second subject, and I'm just going to illustrate to you a little bit of why Prokofiev was doing what he was doing with his harmonies. So let's play the second subject first, so right when we stopped. So it starts in one, what we call key, or you can think of them as moods, and ends in a different one. Can we call it F sharp minor? And then in the middle of the tune, we go to F major. This is not something that you are supposed to do. And yet, the way he uses it here is this harmony is responsible for us feeling like the melody opened up in this sort of gesture of kindness all of a sudden. Well, the first movement follows the outline of sonata form very pristinely. For those of you who might be, for those of you music nerds in this room and might follow what sonata form means, the outlines of the keys structure is followed exactly. You could take it from this piece and apply it to a Beethoven or Haydn score. It's all in the right keys where it matters. It's in the between spaces that it starts differing. But when we get to the second movement, that's when he starts kind of interfering with this classical design of the Beethovenian string quartet. First of all, the second movement is a fast movement, but it opens slowly. You don't usually do this unless it's in the beginning of the piece or at the very end of the piece. There's a very good reason he does that, though. Here's how it sounds at the very beginning of the second movement. Before in the first movement, but it sounds kind of familiar because it's really built on the strange scale that interrupted our little closing harmony that was going so well until that happened. And now the scale is slowed down and it expands until it has nowhere else to go. It's left hanging with this weird chord. Can you play the chord bar 6 last moves? I say chord, but it's only two notes. So it could be in a major key, or it could be in a minor key. And this sort of ambiguity leads us in a very interesting place. What follows next, we used to seem to think it's in a minor key, and we seem to think it's a completely different minor key altogether, and we both play them at the same time. Can you play that? Bar 7. So where do you go after you reach this sort of like sense of expansion? It is here, it is like jarring the juxtaposition. And it's these elements that he's trying to bring back together. He unearths this little grain of discord in the first movement, and he lets it grow in the second. Maybe he didn't need to do that, but he chose to. The rest of the movement seems to struggle with reconciling these two. So when we go into the fast section, what you will hear is the same scale, by the scale, by the way. I mean, usually scale goes like, but Prokofiev's scale that he uses here goes more. It has more bigger steps than you would expect. And it makes you feel like, whoa, where are we going now? Where are we going now? Where are we going now? And so this scale-like upwards motion becomes a very important thematic piece. It's a very basic element in music writing. Plenty of composers use that, but it's what you choose and what you decide to do with that separates great composers from the average. And he decided this is significant. And he keeps playing with us. So at 14, we have the answer to the scale, and we have a little bit of a scale kind of playing around each other. And then, just shortly after, we reach a place where the chorale-like expansion seems to happen, but at much faster tempo. So 14 to 15. And it scutters along after that. As we go through the movement, there's a very peculiar, one of my favorite places in this whole piece, and I have many, which we just have to show you. And you will not miss it when we play it for you. It sounds so distinct, and it's an echo of his style from which he proclaimed to try to move away from, the style of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, where it sounds really jarring. This woman keeps fighting on and keeps, creating new ways to invent and reinvent this tune. And at some point, it calms down and becomes rather placid, and it's sort of peaceful. So we come to a spot when Leo has this tune at one time. You might just find yourself. 22 prime. I cannot count. All right. So this is refreshing. It has nothing to do with either of the problematic stuff in the beginning of the movement. It seems like we are moving here somewhere. Well, let's see what's happening here. So the harmony here is supposed to be this. It's like a F major. And if you would mind, instead we get this. So you remember that problematic, expansive, fill the room place in the beginning of where we got to the ambiguity. This harmony, let's hold together. F, A, C, E. This covers all of them. It's being both of these things. And it's because of that Leo's tune sounds like it just floats above the sky. It would be a lot more earthbound if it was harmonized the way it's supposed to. Well, in any case, this movement eventually comes to an end after a lot of very, very energetic playing and very acrobatic and balletic textures. And the next movement traditionally would be a slow movement, and then we'll finish with another fast movement, and yay, everybody claps, shouts bravo, and we go home happy. Not so much with Prokofiev. He did something very interesting in the slow movement. So it starts with the reminiscence of the opening of the piece, and with the tune that eventually comes back as an amalgamation of the melodies that we heard before. So let's show it to you. Right there. It starts at 9. satisfying to listen to. But being a smart and sensitive composer, Prokofiev realizes that the conflict that he laid out in the second movement didn't go away. That's one of the things that composers are supposed to do in their pieces. If you have a gun on the wall, as Chekhov said, what is it supposed to be doing? Firing again in the third act, right? And that gun didn't fire yet, so it keeps coming back. And Sasha's melody, this is Sasha, by the way. Her melody weaves around, and you will eventually notice it's very subtle at first. It kind of starts gradually rising, and by the time you realize that it's actually this evil scale, it follows that outline, it's a little too late because we're all joined by that, and lo and behold, we have the prophetic plays come back to life. Let me just show that. That's much numbers in prophetic. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So 2, 4 bars. Of that because it's so lovely. The melody from the beginning comes back, transformed completely. It's barely recognizable, but it's so there. And it's another take, it's another opportunity to recover. However, the chorale-like thing comes back again. It comes back twice in this movement, and it seems to be enough to finish it. The second time, we don't quite recover as well, and it seems like the battle is lost. And this rising motion, whatever it represented, prevails. After you hear it second time, you will never hear lines rise up again. They only will be going down until the piece winds down and fades away, essentially. And no, it's not possible to play any other movement after that. So I still stand by my words that Prokofiev was one of the most optimistic of artists and composers in the 20th century. A rare gift, in fact, and this is the position that he himself ascribed to very consciously. I'm not sure why he decided to sort of kill the quartet form here with its own means. You could maybe, imagine that it has something to do with his longtime impresario and the person who was responsible for a lot of his success, Sergei Diaghilev, passing away a year before. Or maybe it could be any other number of reasons. The links between composers' personal life and their output are not as direct as we often wish them to be. But we are going to go ahead and play this piece for you, and I hope you benefited from what we explored here today. And don't expect to be able to kind of take it all in and notice all these things. It takes me at least several times to listen to the piece, to kind of like discover it and to enjoy it in its entirety. So I would encourage you to listen to it again, to go to another concert or to get a recording. Go to YouTube, there's plenty of great recordings of this music, and you will get so much more out of it than if you just hear it once. With this, we're going to start. much to run.
I mean, Alex, you and the musicians had some time aside for Q&A. If people have questions or comments to make, anything you want to ask the musicians, please feel free. Just for a few minutes if you'd like. I've got one question I wanted to ask you. I mean, Prokofiev has kind of I love his orchestration and his orchestral work. I really like it a lot. It has been disparaged, or at least allegedly disparaged, for example, by Shostakovich in his alleged memoirs, where he kind of denigrates Prokofiev for sort of leaving the real orchestration to others. He sort of makes notations, and then his assistants scurry off and orchestrate things. Obviously, this is chamber music, so Prokofiev's coming along. It's 1930. He writes his first string quartet. It's the first time, I think, that he's writing for a small string chamber ensemble. And I'm just curious to what extent you feel like he knows your instruments. In other words, to what extent does he have a feel for the natural range of the violin, the viola, and the cello? And to what extent do you think he's pushing the boundaries of the natural registers of your instruments? I mean, what's he doing with your instruments in this piece? And do you feel like he has it absolutely right? It seems like he's been writing for these instruments forever, or not.
It's an excellent question. I would actually like you guys to answer the second part of it, but I want to address the first part of it. And it didn't sound like a question, but I'm going to make it the whole controversy about Prokofiev's orchestration. Other few parts about it. I mean, he took orchestration classes with Rimsky-Korsakov, who is one of the greatest orchestrators of all time. And but those classes were rather, disappointing to him, because Rimsky-Korsakov was in the last few years of his life, and it was a huge auditorium, and he was essentially, the whole class consisted of him proofreading pieces of students, one after the other, and he just felt bored to tears. But that's not to say that he didn't learn anything. And in fact, he was orchestrating himself, and orchestration is a lot of work. Shostakovich, in the book you referenced, actually mentions a number of times that there's as much to orchestration as there is to composition. And this habit of him of kind of marking the piano score, shorthand score with instruments and leaving it to the assistants to do, came when he had a shortage of time and needed to turn up a lot of music, and he could do some of the trips, but because of the shakiness of the railroads, he couldn't quite write down the notes and orchestration, so he developed a system that was actually very detailed. And all that these assistants had to do is just follow the marks. It was already orchestrated. They just needed to write down the actual score. The validity of Shostakovich's memoir is disputed, but we can only take composers' opinions about each other that far, because I don't believe that it's always wise to do so. They don't always have very objective views of each other. I feel like Prokofiev was pushing the boundaries in orchestration. He was experimenting with orchestration as much as he did with composition. And maybe that was not according to some of the other sets of rules that people think of in orchestration. But what do you guys think about this piece?
I think he has a good sense for the voices of the instruments. There's sometimes awkward writing, but that's true of many great composers who didn't specialize in the instruments they're writing for. Like Brahms is a great example. His music is extraordinary and well worth playing, but it often feels like music written by a pianist for a violinist. And there are bits of that in here, but I think he has such an interesting ear for color and an interesting way of writing sonorities that are so particularly in his voice. The harmonies and the melodies and the way he sets them in the instruments and passes them around is so unique to him. I feel like it's well worth the effort, which is sort of my ultimate test, rather than how convenient it is to play.
I'll add to that. I feel like the keys he uses are they work really well with the instruments, and he does sometimes stretch us. He'll give us a lot of flats or sharps that are tricky, but I feel like it never feels like it's totally dampening the instrument, which can happen sometimes when you're in a key that doesn't ring with your instrument.
I'd add to that I agree with everything you guys just said, and I think where he is a master orchestrationally is with color and texture, and he really has kind of a singular voice for being able to get those feelings across like nobody else. But in the process, sometimes he does sometimes get a little clumsy about how thick something can get. And so sometimes what's important is buried, and we have to work a lot harder to unearth it. So that's one thing, and he does.
Again, like Brahms.
Again, like Brahms. Yeah, Brahms is very much that way.
Although that's sort of where the similarities end. I would never know.
Yeah, perhaps. He does have a good sense of the instruments. The cello part in this quartet is very athletic, in a way that it wasn't, that it wouldn't normally be quite for the time period. But I would say by the second quartet, a lot of those things have become much simpler and clearer. I think that, like the balance issues aren't as, don't require workarounds in rehearsal in the same manner.
Well, also the key he chose for this piece, the D minor, is very awkward for the instruments, and he did this knowingly. So the main notes of D minor lie kind of below our open string, so we have to constantly do something that is a little more effort to find. But I think that's, he was certainly aware of that. I think he was interested in figuring it out from the point of view of his chess player mind, if he can make it work like that. And it can't step criticism on the cello part sometimes. Yeah.
So at the beginning, you compared what Prokofiev did with what Beethoven did. One example. Are there other examples in the piece that you would where you hear Beethoven?
Well, what's interesting is that, he doesn't quote Beethoven directly, not that I'm aware of, but if you think about the kind of tools that Beethoven used, when he constructed his quartets, if you look at the first movement, the first subject is in B minor, second subject should be then in F sharp minor major, and it is. The concluding subject is, we are ending again in the dominant key, the development starts in that, and then we move back to the tonic, and the second subject in recapitulation is again in the tonic. So all of these check boxes are there. In recapitulation, he is essentially playing around with the contractions and modifications of the themes that were there before. He's using Beethoven's motivic development to a degree with his own themes, with his own language. It's Beethoven's toolbox, and what's
And if you're not familiar with sonata form,
yeah.
It's the form that really began in the classical period and then was used by most composers after that, for not just for sonatas obviously, but for quartets and symphonies. And at its simplest, it's a first theme and a second theme appear in the exposition, and they have particular key areas that are sort of designated for them, as Alex was just going into. And then there's a development section where those themes are often sort of duking it out, and then there's a recapitulation, and all of those. It's sort of a formula where the harmonic structure is tied to the formal structure.
Yes, a very dynamic and balanced and clear structure that has been used again and again by composers for more than a century, and so naturally avant-gardists try to shun it and move away from it, and when he starts using it back in all of its glory, it's a little bit of a statement. One of the parallels that I didn't mention is that Beethoven quartet that we just played in the beginning stands out from that opus. That's the opus 18 number 6. There are 6 quartets in that set. The first set of quartets Beethoven produced. And in that last one, he has a slow introduction to the last movement, which is rather expansive and kind of tragic. But then the last movement comes in, and we end the piece. So he uses a slow introduction to the second movement, which is also fast. maybe he took that idea from Beethoven, but then again, the way he sabotages this piece, he uses all the same tools that Beethoven would have used. There's nothing avant-garde about taking the kernel from the first movement, engrossing it into this kind of chorale-like monumental structure and having it kind of come back into the slow movement and basically, blow it up and make it impossible to continue. Nobody has, at the time, aware from the classical or romantic era, has quite done that, but this is not in itself a revolution.
And pretty much everyone who writes a string quartet after Beethoven, on some level or another, I think, is responding to Beethoven. I mean, he used and then stretched and then broke every rule in such fascinating ways that I feel like great composers after that looked to that as inspiration for, how to how to break rules of their own, or how to use the rules to set expectations and then alter them. So.
Well, if there are no more questions, please join me in thanking our musicians.